Gibraltar, a rocky outcrop standing at the gateway to the Mediterranean, right in the strait that bears its name and separates Europe from Africa. A place of enormous strategic importance because the Mediterranean has only two entrances, the Suez Canal and the Strait of Gibraltar. Controlling one of them is already a big deal, but imagine controlling both. Now, for those of you who aren't from Spain, logic would probably tell you this little piece of land belongs to Spain. But no, Gibraltar belongs to the United Kingdom. And that raises the big question, why? What on earth are the British doing there? As always, we have to look back at history to find the answer, and the story of how Gibraltar ended up in British hands is quite something. So get comfortable, because we're just getting started. We are at the very end of the 17th century. King Charles II of Spain, known as the Bewitched, dies without an heir, and suddenly there are two contenders for the throne. One of them was from the House of Habsburg, the dynasty that had ruled Spain for generations. His name was Charles, nephew, though not by blood, of Charles II, and naturally backed by Leopold I, the Emperor of Austria. The other was Philip, Charles II's great-nephew from the House of Bourbon, the royal family of France, and of course supported by the French king. The problem was that the idea of France and the Spanish kingdoms joining forces terrified the rest of Europe. It was a potential superpower that could upset the entire balance of power on the continent. Among those who were not thrilled about it was England, which saw both France and Spain as rivals. In the end, no one could agree on who should take the throne, and that disagreement led to war, a brutal conflict between those who wanted a Habsburg king and those who wanted a Bourbon king. Each major power chose a side. France, Cologne, and Mantua supported Philip of Bourbon, while the Holy Roman Empire, which included Austria, Prussia, and Hanover, together with the Dutch Republic, England, and Scotland, backed Charles of Austria. Portugal, Savoy, and Bavaria initially supported Philip too, but eventually switched sides and supported Charles of Austria. The war turned into what you could call a super war for its time, something that, in proportion, would be the equivalent of a world war in the 20th century. Different sources speak of a death toll ranging from 400,000 to over 1 million. And yes, I know, far more people died in the world wars, but we also have to remember that in 1700, the global population was much smaller than in the 20th century. Around Gibraltar, things escalated quickly. In 1702, an Anglo-Dutch fleet arrived in Cadiz and landed troops in Rota and El Puerto de Santa Maria, but failed to take the area. Then in 1704, another Anglo-Dutch fleet with 10,000 men, 1,500 cannons, and the support of a battalion of 350 Catalan soldiers loyal to the Austrian cause, tried to take Gibraltar. The fortress, defended by just 380 men, of whom only 80 were actual soldiers, surrendered after a fierce battle. Loyalist Bourbon forces besieged the city afterward, but were unable to retake it and eventually withdrew. Queen Anne of England wasted no time in reacting. She decided to keep Gibraltar for herself, taking it away from her supposed ally, the Austrian pretender Archduke Charles, just like that, without his consent or even a warning. In October 1705, she ordered the remaining civilian population to be expelled. In 1706, she declared Gibraltar a free English port. In 1707, she appointed the British General Roger Elliot as governor, and by 1711, all foreign troops had been expelled, leaving only British forces in control of the Rock. As the war dragged on, the Bourbon side began to gain the upper hand, largely thanks to French support. Still, victory had been anything but easy, and by the end of the conflict, every major power in Europe was desperate to sign a peace treaty that would finally bring the fighting to an end. That peace came with the Treaty of Utrecht, signed between Spain and the United Kingdom. In essence, the treaty stated that Britain would recognize Philip V of Bourbon as the legitimate king of Spain, in exchange for keeping Gibraltar and Minorca. But the part about Gibraltar had two key conditions. First, Spain ceded the territory to Britain in perpetuity, but sovereignty would technically remain Spanish. And second, if the British Crown ever decided to give up Gibraltar, it would have to be returned to Spain. But the British, as usual, did things their own way. They ignored the agreement to respect Spanish law in the area, started trading all kinds of goods illegally, and even occupied land that didn't belong to them. They went as far as expelling the local priest, the last Spaniard still living there. In 1727, another war broke out between Spain and Britain, and Gibraltar was besieged once again. But nothing worked, and the war ended without Spain managing to recover the territory. Afterwards, Spain and the United Kingdom agreed that the isthmus connecting Gibraltar to the mainland would become a neutral zone, free of military presence from either country. This included the very area the British had seized unlawfully, but of course, they never left. In response, in 1730, the King of Spain ordered the construction of a line of fortifications behind the Spanish side of the neutral zone. The third and final military attempt to retake Gibraltar came decades later, during the American War of Independence, in what became known as the Great Siege between 1779 and 1783. Spain was supporting the Americans in their fight for independence, which once again made Spain and Britain enemies. But once more, the siege failed. During the War of Independence against the French, in the early 19th century, Spain was left severely weakened and lost much of its ability to achieve anything diplomatically. Repeated epidemics throughout that century also took their toll, while Britain quietly expanded further into the so-called neutral zone. By 1830, the British went one step further, changing Gibraltar's status to that of a British crown colony, effectively stripping Spain of any remaining sovereignty over the rock. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Gibraltar became even more important, serving as a perfect stopover for British ships traveling from Asia into the Mediterranean. Then came the 20th century, and with it, more changes for Gibraltar, particularly its size. And how did it grow? The British began excavating the rock, carving out tunnels and defensive fortifications. The debris from those works was used to reclaim 26 hectares of land from the sea. At the same time, in 1909, Britain built the Gibraltar Fence, cementing its occupation of more than 800 meters of the isthmus that was supposed to remain neutral. But that wasn't all. The British later expanded their territorial waters around Gibraltar unilaterally, starting a diplomatic conflict that remains unresolved to this day. Britain claims a right to 12 nautical miles, as established by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, while Spain refers back to the Treaty of Utrecht, which clearly states that the British waters are limited to, and I quote, the area surrounding the fortress that can be reached by its cannons. In other words, just the harbor, nothing more. In 1938, Britain approved the construction of a military airfield on the strip of land between the fence and the Rock of Gibraltar. Its runway extended more than 800 meters into the Bay of Algeciras, something Spain has always considered illegal. But when the British began building it, the international situation, right in the middle of the Second World War, and with Spain trying not to upset the Allies, didn't leave much room for protest. During the war, Gibraltar became one of the most important British military bases between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, a vital stopover for Allied convoys, and one of the few territories in continental Europe that never fell under Axis control. In fact, if Spain had joined the war on the Axis side, it would likely have meant the capture of Gibraltar. Plans for such an operation still exist today, both from the Spanish and the German sides. Presumably, if Rommel's Afrika Korps had taken the Suez Canal, Spain would have had little choice but to either join the war or allow the Germans to seize the rock. In 1946, under Chapter 11 of the United Nations Charter, the United Kingdom listed Gibraltar as a non-self-governing territory. That designation included it among the territories subject to decolonization, which sparked a new debate. Could Gibraltar become independent? The Gibraltarians say yes, while Spain points back to the Treaty of Utrecht, which clearly states that if Gibraltar is not British, it must be returned to Spain. And that brings us to the present. The Spanish government continues to claim sovereignty over the rock, though every British government has rejected that claim. The people of Gibraltar, on the other hand, have consistently defended what they call their right to self-determination. In 2 referendums, they have overwhelmingly voted against rejoining Spain. In the most recent one, held in 2002, the proposal for joint sovereignty with Britain was rejected by 98.97% of voters. And finally, in 2016, 95% of Gibraltarians voted to remain in the European Union during the Brexit referendum. But since the United Kingdom left, Gibraltar has also ceased to be part of EU territory. And for now, the full consequences of that remain a mystery. So, what do you think? What status should Gibraltar have today? That's all for today's video. You know the drill. If you enjoyed the story, give it a like, hit subscribe, and dive in for the next one.